Okay, guys, we're back again. We're now going to start with another true crime example of the Goldilocks narrative. This is going to be about the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey. I would point out, too, that I'm going to be doing these in order of, well, loosely in order of complexity. I mean, I may do some later that are more complex, but so far, I started with some that I thought were the most complex. So 4 or 5 of these will be the most complex, and I'll do those first. Then we can move on to others. So the Goldilocks narrative analysis, the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey, Boulder, Colorado, December 26, 1996. By me, Kelly Van Houten. Section 1, the Goldilocks narrative framework. The Goldilocks narrative is an Occam's razor-based analytical methodology for identifying the most parsimonious explanation in a complex evidential environment. The correct theory fits all material evidence using the minimum number of required assumptions. Theories that explain away inconvenient evidence or that require unsupported conspiratorial scaffolding fail the test. The Jonbenet Ramsey case is perhaps the single best demonstration of the framework's power, precisely because the evidence landscape is so contradictory on its surface. Exactly. This is why I think this one's a really good example of applying this. And because the GN, Goldilocks narrative thesis, resolves those apparent contradictions rather than sidestepping them. Framework pillars. Evidence economy accounts for the most evidentiary facts using the fewest logical steps. Narrative parsimony. Reject theories requiring unsupported actors and explain coordination or conspiracies requiring many parties' silence. Explanatory supremacy. The winning theory is not simply adequate. It must explain evidence that competing theories cannot. Contradiction resolution. Where evidence appears contradictory, the Goldilocks theory should resolve the contradiction rather than dismiss one side of it. Investigative failure weight. Documented investigative failures and data. Who benefited from each failure? Does the pattern point consistently in one direction? So that's the gist of it. Part 2, the 3-layer thesis. The Goldilocks narrative for the Jonbenet Ramsey case is built on 3 interlocking layers. Understood separately, each layer is plausible. Understood together, they constitute the most parsimonious explanation for the entire evidential record, including evidence that has stubbornly defied explanation under both the family guilt and the standard intruder theories. Layer 1. An intruder committed the murder. Okay, so here's where we're telling you where this is going, a little, giving you a little heads up, right? Because this is early in the document, but I'm going to substantiate this further down in the document. So layer 1, an intruder committed the murder. We think that is the most likely narrative. An unknown male entered the Ramsey home on Christmas night 1996 through the unlocked back door. He murdered Jonbenet. The physical, biological, and trace evidence, most significantly the unknown male DNA recovered from under the fingernails of both hands and in her underwear. You often don't hear this pointed out, but here it is. Points inescapably outward, away from the family. The garrote, the sexual contact, the boot print, and the open back door are all consistent with an opportunistic intruder. Crime that escalated upon unexpected discovery. So let's back up here. What we're saying here is one of the most significant findings was that DNA under the fingernails in both hands. That's if you can exclude the family from that DNA, it's absolutely, far more simply, it's going to be a much more simpler narrative and have much more explanatory power if you just say that it's most likely that this was an intruder. This was an unknown person, a person unknown to the Ramseys. Layer 2, Patsy suspected Burke in the immediate aftermath. And here's where it gets interesting. When Patsy discovered Jonbenet's body in the early hours of December 26, 1996, she did not immediately process it as an intruder crime. Think about this, guys. Put yourself in her shoes. The head blow, blunt trauma consistent with something a child might wield, pointed her maternal instinct toward Burke. In the shock and grief of those first hours, before calling 911, Patsy concluded that Burke had struck his sister and that Jonbenet was dead. This acute suspicion, whether correct or not in its source attribution, drove her next action. Okay. And, I don't know that Patsy concluded that Burke had struck her, but she was very worried about that possibility. Layer 3, Patsy wrote the ransom note to cover for Burke. And this just explains a whole lot right here, guys. A whole lot of stuff. We don't have to get into all that, but, we know about all the debates and controversy over who wrote the damn note. Well, this answers that very cleanly. Patsy wrote the ransom note to cover for Burke. Operating under the belief that Burke had killed Jonbenet, possibly accidentally, who knows, and knowing Jonbenet was already dead, Patsy composed a ransom note using her own notepad and pen. The note was not a kidnapping fraud. It was a desperate, grief-stricken act of maternal cover, intended to redirect investigators away from her son and toward a fictional external threat. She did not realize she was also inadvertently covering for the actual killer. The intruder she did not yet know existed. So she didn't realize that she was actually covering for the intruder. Inadvertently, but that's what she ended up doing. The Goldilocks narrative paradox. Patsy wrote the note to cover for Burke for a crime he did not commit. And in doing so, created the primary evidence used to implicate the family in a crime an intruder actually committed. No other theory resolves both the note's family language fingerprints and the physical evidence's outward trajectory simultaneously. It gets better. Case facts. Victim, Jonbenet, Patricia Ramsey, age 6. Date, December 25th to 26th. We don't know for sure what date she actually expired, so we're right around the midnight hour of the 25th and the 26th. The location is their home. Cause of death was, now here's interesting. This is interesting. Asphyxia by strangulation, but also craniocerebral trauma. Pretty extreme trauma. Sexual assault was confirmed by autopsy. Body found basement wine cellar by John Ramsey, approximately 1 p.m. on December 26. Family exoneration, 2008, by Boulder District Attorney, based on DNA evidence. And that was a good call. I don't know if they, and this is a good question about those district attorneys and all that. I don't know if they really knew what had happened. If they know what I'm going through. But I think all they had to do was look at the DNA evidence and say, okay, you know what, we're not going to prosecute this. But I do wonder how much of this they really knew. I really do. We'll get to all that too, and all the legal implications of, being exposed. Unsolved active case. BPD, as of 25-26, new forensic testing underway. Yeah, they're going to be doing, probably at some point, familial DNA, genetic genealogy, to track down this person. The problem is you got to have enough of the sample, and it gets destroyed when you do it. So you've got to be very careful how you do that, and the technology keeps getting better and better, so they can use smaller and smaller samples. That's what's holding it up. They need better technology. And there's been a lot of arguing between John Ramsey and the Boulder Police Department about this. John Ramsey thinks that it's ready to go. We should go ahead and test it. And then the police are saying, well, no, we need to, it's not enough. We need to let the technology get a little better or whatever. We need to wait until we can do a better job. So that's where that is right now. Timeline of the critical hours. Christmas Day, approximately 10 p.m. Ramsey family returns home from Christmas party at children put to bed. Estimated midnight to 2 a.m. Crime occurs. Neighbor Melody Stanton reports hearing a child scream around midnight. 5:52 a.m. December 26, Patsy calls 911, reporting a ransom note and Jonbenet missing. 6 a.m. Boulder police arrive. Scene is not secured. Friends and family are invited into the home. Not good. 1 p.m. police ask John Ramsey to search the house. He finds Jonbenet's body in the basement wine cellar, removes the duct tape, and carries her upstairs, contaminating the scene. December 27th, autopsy performed. DNA recovered from fingernails and underwear. January 1997, DNA analysis confirms unknown male profile. Does not match any Ramsey family member. Boulder Police Department does not share this with the DA's office for months. You see what they're doing here? There's a little bit of zeal here in trying to get people convicted that law enforcement has a bad reputation of doing. And this is an example of that. It's a little mercenary, what they did there. Not telling the DA this. The evidentiary cornerstone, DNA under both fingernails. Of all the evidence in this case, the fingernail DNA is the most analytically powerful and the most underweighted in popular discourse. Most people aren't even aware of this. So-called experts on this topic, they're not even aware that there was DNA under the fingernails. Check out the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's report, if you're curious. They did a report. think it was within like 6 months of the murder. It wasn't long after the murder. And they pointed this out. All right, so what the evidence shows. During the autopsy, the coroner recovered unknown male DNA from under the fingernails of both Jonbenet's right and left hands. You see, that symmetry right there is telling you that this is definitely an aggressor. Right? I mean, it could be under one hand and you might have another explanation, but when it's both hands and it's the same DNA, it's really hard to ignore that. During the autopsy, the coroner recovered unknown male DNA from under the fingernails of both Jonbenet's right and left hands. This DNA did not match John Ramsey, Bert Ramsey, or any other family member, friend, or person of interest tested in the case. It was also consistent with the unknown male DNA profile found in blood in her underwear and on the waistband of her long johns. In 2008, this DNA profile, present across multiple items, formed the evidentiary basis for the Boulder DA's formal exoneration of the Ramsey family. See, it was the DNA. They kind of can't, in good conscience, prosecute somebody when they know they've already been excluded by DNA. They know there's a perpetrator out there. It's not them. While this evidence is analytically decisive, bilateral presence, DNA under fingernails of both hands, is a signature of a defensive struggle. It indicates that Jonbenet physically fought her attacker, dragging skin cells from someone whose DNA does not belong in this family's profile. Concordant profile, the fingernail DNA matched the same unknown male profile found in her underwear and on her long johns. This is not ambient contamination from multiple sources. It is a single consistent donor present across intimate contact points. Read that again. Exclusion breadth. The profile was compared against all family members, household employees, family friends who entered the home that day, and over 200 other persons of interest. It matched none of them. Chain of custody. The DNA was recovered during the autopsy before significant scene contamination could have introduced it post-mortem. The counter-arguments and their analytical weight. Critics of the intruder theory, as it came to be known, including some forensic experts, have argued that fingernail DNA can accumulate from incidental contact, handshakes, handling, normal interaction, and does not necessarily indicate a struggle. This counter-argument must be taken seriously, but ultimately fails the Goldilocks narrative test for 3 reasons. Okay, how are we going to reach this conclusion? This is very important to understand what we're doing here. What we are doing here is we're saying, of all of these options, which one has the most explanatory power and requires the fewest number of assumptions? Assuming that she picked up DNA from, in multiple places on her body from the same, source is a bigger assumption than simply saying that she got it from one source. That it all came from one source and it wasn't different sources. That on its face is Occam's razor. Bilateral concordance, incidental environmental contamination producing the same unknown male profile under both hands simultaneously is statistically implausible, basically what I just said. The bilateral presence is the defensive struggle signature. Profile consistency across items. The same donor profile appears on intimate articles of clothing, her underwear and long johns, not just her fingernails. Random environmental contamination does not produce matched profiles across multiple intimate body points on a child's body. Negative family match. If the DNA were residual from innocent handling by someone in her environment, we would expect it to match someone she regularly interacted with. It matches no one in her documented world. That is an intruder signature, not a contamination artifact. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, but I think we're still showing that it's simpler to go with the conclusion. It's more parsimonious and it's more explanatory to just go with this is from an intruder. Okay. Goldilocks narrative standard. The fingernail DNA taken in combination with the matched underwear profile and the breadth of the exclusion testing constitutes physical evidence of an unknown male's direct intimate contact with Jonbenet at or near the time of her death. Any theory of guilt that does not account for this DNA fails the Goldilocks test before the first page is turned. The horror of that paragraph is it's really disturbing that you even have to say this stuff. that intimate contact at the time of death. It's really creepy. All right. Just shows you the severity of the crime. The full intruder evidence profile. The fingernail DNA is the cornerstone, but it is not the only physical evidence consistent with an intruder. The following evidence threads collectively constitute a robust intruder profile that has been systematically underweighted by investigators focused on the family. Physical scene evidence. The boot print. Investigators found an unidentified boot print in the mold on the floor of the wine cellar where Jonbenet's body was found. The print did not match the footwear of any member of the Ramsey family or any identified visitor to the home. This is direct physical evidence of an unidentified person in the room where the body was deposited. No adequate innocent explanation for this print has ever been established. More parsimonious, but absence of proof is not proof of absence. So that's caveated, but it has force. The basement window. Detective Lou Smith, a retired Colorado Springs detective brought in by the DA's office in 1997, and widely regarded as one of the most rigorous investigators ever assigned to the case, documented a basement window with a broken latch and argued it was the intruder's entry and exit point. A suitcase was found positioned beneath the window on the interior, consistent with someone having used it as a step. Smith was so convinced of the intruder evidence that he resigned from the investigation in 1998. Writing in his resignation letter, at this point in the investigation, the case tells me that John and Patsy Ramsey did not kill their daughter. That a very dangerous killer is still out there, and no one is actively looking for him. This is a sad commentary that happens all the time. All the time. This is why something like 20% of people on death row are actually not guilty of the murder for which they were convicted. This is why. It's stuff like this. Alright, and this family had the means to fight this too, by the by. The GN thesis does not adopt the basement window as the intruder's entry or exit point. The back door of the Ramsey home was reportedly unlocked on Christmas night and was found open in the early morning hours of December 26th. So we're going to differ here a little bit from Lou Smith because we think that the simpler and more parsimonious and more explanatory, actually, mini-narrative there is that he came in the back door and he left through the back door. Human beings tend to do that. They tend to exit where they came through, especially if it's an unfamiliar place. Entry and exit through an unlocked door requires no forced access, leaves no trace, and is the path of least resistance for an unfamiliar intruder. The open back door is consistent with a hasty, unplanned exit. Let me read that again. The open back door is consistent with a hasty, unplanned exit. Well, why would that be? Lou Smith's window evidence is noted here as part of the broader intruder evidentiary record, but is not a component of the Goldilocks narrative thesis specific scenario. The garrote. The garrote used to strangle Jonbenet was fashioned from a length of nylon cord and the broken handle of one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrushes. The bottom third of the paintbrush was never recovered, despite extensive searching of the home. Family guilt theorists cite the paintbrush as evidence of insider knowledge. The Goldilocks thesis counters that the paint tote was in the basement within easy reach, and an intruder who had just struck a child in the moment of panic would reach for whatever was immediately available. The garrote's crude, unprofessional construction is the forensic signature of improvisation under stress, not premeditation, and not the work of a 9-year-old. Things were not going right. At this point, everything had gone sideways, and we're going to get into that. But the actor becomes more and more impulsive as this crime unfolds. And impulsivity is very important to track and understand in a crime. But we'll get to more of that here in a minute. The pineapple. Jonbenet's autopsy revealed undigested pineapple in her stomach, consumed 2 or 3 hours before death. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table with Patsy's fingerprints on the bowl and Burke's on the spoon. Neither John nor Patsy reported feeding her pineapple that night. This evidence has been used both by the Burke guilt theorist, suggesting Burke lured her with food, and more straightforwardly by intruder theorists, noting that an intruder who had access to the kitchen could have offered her food to gain compliance or cooperation. Under either reading, the pineapple does not support Patsy as the killer. Yeah, see, I mean, even here, they're going into more complicated, more assumption-based, hypotheses. The simpler thing here And it just doesn't mention the silverware. But the silverware and the dishes were inappropriate for what was being eaten and what they were drinking. In other words, you would not use that kind of stuff, spoons that are serving spoons, for just a small bowl of pineapple, a glass for tea, iced tea. I mean, you could, but it just doesn't make sense. And what I think is far simpler is just that Burke was trying to he was trying to get Jonbenet something to eat that night. That's all it was. The Patsy fingerprint on the bowl is because she's the homemaker and it was up in the cabinet. So that doesn't tell us anything, but his fingerprints on all that stuff definitely tells us everything we need to know if we look at it in the simplest way possible. No assumptions, full explanatory power. So it's probably the case that Burke set that up for her. Now, more information later might change that, but for right now, that's what we know. Behavioral evidence supporting intruder. The ransom note. The note demanded exactly $118,000, a figure nearly identical to John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from Access Graphics. John himself noted this to the first officers on the scene. Under the Goldilocks thesis, this figure is significant not because it points to an intruder with insider financial knowledge, but because it points to Patsy as the note's author. Now here we go again, parsimony. It's not, the simpler explanation here is that Patsy wrote it and she knew the amount. And we'll get into that more later, but I mean the handwriting and all that analysis pointed more to her than Burke or John. I mean, I don't think Burke could have written it anyway. But anyway, Patsy knew the bonus figure. She used an authentic detail from her own knowledge of their financial world to lend the fiction credibility. This is fully consistent with a grieving mother composing a note under panic, reaching for specific details she knew to be real. The figure does not require an intruder who had researched the family. You see another assumption here. It requires only that Patsy wrote the note, which the Goldilocks thesis establishes on independent grounds. The 911 recording, John's voice, and Burke. The 911 call placed by Patsy Ramsey at 5:52 a.m. on December 26th contains an audio detail that has received insufficient analytical attention. In the background of the recording, John Ramsey's voice can be heard saying words to the effect of, "We are not talking to you," directed at Burke, in a tone described by analysts as irritated or dismissive. This is not the response of a father reflexively comforting a frightened child in a moment of family crisis. It is the response of a parent who does not want his son speaking. A parent who, in those early chaotic hours, may still have been operating under the same acute suspension that drove Patsy to write the note. That's probably what happened. Under the GN3 later hypothesis, John's curt dismissal of Burke on that recording is consistent with a household in which at least one parent believed Burke may have been responsible for what had happened to John. And clearly we've already established at this point, we'll establish it even more, but at this point it's obvious that that's, a mistake, that he didn't do it and it was in fact an intruder. The revised intruder profile, opportunistic, not predatory. Now, here's something I think that's been missed, too. When you look at the behaviors, the location of everything, what doors were where, and it helps to have a floor plan, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But it does suggest that something went sideways and that the murder was an opportunistic thing, not really predatory. In other words, he didn't come there planning to do that. He came there planning probably to rob them. And when he got caught cold-handed, we'll get to that in a minute, red-handed, he basically killed her. He panicked. We'll get to that in a minute. Earlier versions of the intruder-based analyses, including Lou Smith's work, have tended to characterize the intruder as a sophisticated, organized predator with prior knowledge of the Ramsey family, their schedule, their home layout, their finances. The Goldilocks thesis, informed by the full revised sequence of events, does not require this profile and finds it less parsimonious than the alternative. This guy had no idea what he was getting into. He broke into a house on, around Christmas night, whatever, in the middle of the night, late at night, and the family came home and caught him, and he was stuck. They didn't catch him, but I mean, they were there, and it was very difficult for him to get out of there at that point. At that point, he would have been doing everything possible to figure out how to get out of there without them noticing. The evidence is more consistent with an opportunistic intruder, possibly homeless, possibly under the influence of drugs or alcohol, who entered the Ramsey home through the unlocked back door on Christmas night. A night when the home had been active and the door may have been left unsecured after the family's return from a neighbor's party. This profile requires no prior surveillance, no insider knowledge, and no organized planning. It requires only an unlocked door and a person willing to enter an unoccupied seeming home. And, well, when they came in, it was unoccupied, right? There was nobody there. They had come home right before going to bed. The nature of the crime supports this revised profile. The sexual act committed on Jonbenet appears under the Goldilocks narrative sequence to have been reactive and opportunistic rather than the primary purpose of the intrusion. The garrote was improvised in seconds, and it looks like it. The exit was panicked. None of this is the behavioral signature of an organized preferential child predator who had planned and rehearsed this crime. It is the behavioral signature of someone whose night went catastrophically wrong the moment a 6-year child opened a door in the dark. This profile also carries a forensic implication. A transient or drug-addicted individual is statistically less likely to appear in law enforcement DNA databases, which would explain why nearly 3 decades of database comparisons have failed to produce a match. The 2025-26 forensic genetic genealogy effort, which works from family tree reconstruction rather than direct database hits, is the appropriate tool for this profile, and its results are the most anticipated development in this case's history. Very true. We know that, I think that's covered further down, but we know that Jonbenet voided at the door of that closet, so we know exactly where she died. And my hypothesis, and we're going to get to this, but the simplest thing that would explain everything is that he was startled. He was carrying a flashlight of some kind. He was carrying something, a tool, a flashlight, something, probably a mag light. And he simply reacted. He simply racked her over the head. And she died and voided right there. And, anybody doing that's going to realize this person doesn't look like they're getting up, So they're going to need to make it look more like a sexual act. They're going to want to make it look more confusing. Just racking her on the head isn't going to, probably isn't all they're going to want to stage this. The theft motive, why he was there. One dimension of the intruder profile that has been absent from most analyses is the simplest one. Why was he in the house at all? The Goldilocks narrative thesis, with its revised opportunistic intruder profile, provides a parsimonious answer. Christmas night in an affluent Boulder neighborhood is precisely the moment a drug-addicted individual looking to steal sensible items would target an unlocked home. Presents had been opened that day. Electronics, jewelry, cash, and gift cards would be visible and accessible throughout the house. The Ramsey home, a large, well-appointed residence whose family had been out that evening, was an attractive target for someone in desperate need of items to convert to drug money. Another little tidbit here, guys. Drugs, which I think were involved here, they lower impulse control considerably. I think that played a role here. This motive also explains why the intruder was in the basement specifically. A thief working through an unfamiliar home in the dark would naturally begin with the ground floor and basement, the most likely locations for electronics, wrapped gifts, and stored valuables. He was not waiting for Jonbenet. He was not there because of Jonbenet. He was executing a theft when a door in the dark opened and a 6-year-old child discovered him. Everything that followed was a consequence of that single unplanned moment. It is most likely that the child opened the door exiting the closet where she thought more Christmas gifts might be. That's where they stored their Christmas gifts. It's more likely that she actually had the door closed for whatever reason and opened it to come out. And he was coming down a narrow hallway that led straight to that door, and he ran right into her and racked her with a flashlight. And she died right there. We'll talk about this in a minute, but there was also a loud scream heard by Melanie Stanton. I think we said that earlier. I think that happened when she saw him, right before she got racked. The theft motive further explains the absence of any taken items from the home. An intruder who had successfully completed a theft would have left with something. This one left with only the flashlight and the paintbrush handle, the two objects most directly tied to what he had done, because he fled in blind panic through the back door without completing what he came to do. I mean, this is obviously simpler, I think. The theft was never executed. The crime that was committed was never planned in the first place. Investigator Lou Smith's stun gun theory. Smith identified two small oval abrasions on Jonbenet's body, one on her cheek and one on her back, that he believed were consistent with stun gun contact marks. If accurate, this would indicate a sophisticated level of premeditation by the perpetrator, inconsistent with an impulsive family assault and consistent with the predator who had planned the encounter. This theory has not been definitively confirmed or refuted, so it's not necessary to the narrative, so we're not going to go any further with that. We only focus on what we need to put the narrative together, right? The interrupted intruder, in fact, the more other stuff you add, the more it weakens it. So you want to assiduously avoid extra information whenever possible. The interrupted intruder, a refined scenario. What Patsy would have seen. A critical evidentiary point has been underweighted in most analyses of Patsy Ramsey's psychological state in the immediate aftermath of discovery. The catastrophic 8.5-inch skull fracture that caused Jonbenet's craniocerebral trauma was entirely internal. There was no external laceration, no visible wound through her hair, no blood on the surface of her scalp that a layperson would readily identify. What Patsy would have seen was the garrote and the ligature marks on her daughter's neck. She did not need to identify or even observe the head injury to conclude that Jonbenet was dead. The garrote alone was sufficient. This is an important clarification. Patsy's acute suspicions in those early hours do not depend on correctly diagnosing the cause of death. It depended only on knowing her daughter was gone and making a panicked maternal inference about what had happened. In other words, she's not a coroner, right? So she's not going to be able to say, oh, well, she got hit in the head. She's just going to see the garrote, which is just further going to make her more suspicious that it was Burke, because there are two ways you get a garrote formed like that, right? It's an adult who may know how to tie a knot, may know how to create a garrote, but he's panicked and he's in a hurry, so he throws it together very sloppily. And the other way you get it is you have a child do it, right? This worked against Patsy because it just further confused the issue. The ransom note's most analytically significant moment is Patsy's live television admission on Larry King Live. When asked why a kidnapper would write a ransom note for a child already dead in the basement, she answered spontaneously, "I think it was a ruse to throw us off." This was not a prepared answer. It was a reflexive disclosure of what she knew to be true, because she wrote the ruse. John Ramsey immediately intervened to correct the framing. The behavioral pattern of emotionally driven truth disclosure is not limited to that single incident. And here's a really juicy one that always haunted me. On the morning following the murder, a neighbor arrived and exclaimed that she had no idea what was happening. She had just gotten there. She sort of exclaimed, frustratingly, we don't know what happened. I don't know what's happened here. Tell me, Patsy's immediate unguarded response was, "We don't know either." If you have no reason not to accept that, parsimony suggests accept it. Especially when it's unforced and it's impulsive. I think she was telling the truth that she didn't know. She was still trying to figure out what had actually happened. She didn't know if Burke had done it or not. I think that's one of the most haunting responses ever given. At that moment, she had admitted the whole story. Was she a criminal in the traditional sense? No, she was a panicked mother. Is this felony tampering with evidence, interference with an investigation, blah, blah, blah? Yeah, it was. People go to prison for that. But the circumstances here are really unusual. And that's the problem with our justice system and why they had to be quiet about it, right? Because either way, if she had gone to trial and she had said, well, I didn't know if it was Burke, but I later found out it wasn't. The problem with this is that they're going to see that as, it's kind of like the Salem witch trials. Once you figure out a witch is evil, you just want to hang her. And at that point, I think people had already decided they wanted to hang Patsy Ramsey. Yeah, ye shall hang by the neck until ye shall be dead, dead, dead. It's the Salem witch trials. That is the verdict issued over and over and over. That's what would have happened here. Our legal system isn't all squared away like people think. This is a striking reply from a mother whose child has allegedly been kidnapped. Remember, she was kidnapped from the letter now. A parent performing grief and shock in a scripted cover narrative would almost certainly produce something more emotionally performative. We don't know either is the response of someone genuinely disoriented, still processing, still trying to understand whether Burke was responsible, still uncertain about what had actually occurred in her home the night before. It is, under the Goldilocks narrative three-layer thesis, precisely the answer we would expect. Right? Because again, parsimony, explanatory power. Whatever has the most of both of those wins every time. For every single piece of evidence. That's how you look at it. Entry, exit, and the back door. The Goldilocks narrative thesis holds that the intruder entered and exited through the Ramsey's home's back door, which was reportedly unlocked on the night of December 25th. Isn't that interesting? It was reportedly unlocked. This is something to think about, guys. If the door was unlocked, what the Ramseys had done when they left the house was they just put a big target on it. They just put a big bullseye on their house. Homeless, petty thieves, drug addicts, they'll probably, they'll hit a neighborhood like that. There was an alley behind that house. They'll hit a neighborhood like that and come in kind of from some sneaky direction, like an alleyway, where everybody can't see them. And they'll just go try a bunch of doors. So the funny thing about it is they should have checked the fingerprints on doors of neighboring homes. Because I'll bet you $100 they would have found that perpetrator's fingerprints on another door. It would have been there because he would have tried to open the door. That's why he hit the Ramsey house, because it was unlocked. This isn't rocket science. Entry through an unlocked door requires no forced access, no navigation of a window well in the dark, and leaves no physical trace. It is the path of least resistance for any intruder, familiar with the home or not. People in unfamiliar environments under stress tend to open back... Oh, wait, hold on a second. People in unfamiliar environments under stress tend to exit the way they entered. This is a known thing. This has been studied in psychology. It's not a revelation. Especially under stress. They're going to go out the way they came. It's a very strong instinct, a survival instinct. People in unfamiliar environments under stress tend to exit the way they entered. The open back door found in the early morning hours is therefore consistent with both entry and exit through the same route. And this is getting supported by multiple things. It's not just that, people tend to go out the door they came in. I mean, you got to see this is all interlocking, right? I mean, we also have the fact that that this guy was probably impulsive. We have signs all over the place that he was impulsive and panicked. So that's exactly what you would do if you're impulsive and you're panicked. You're going to run out that back door. You're not going to bother to close it. You're going to run out that back door, and you're going to haul ass, but you're going to go to the door that you came in. Because that was planned, right? Before all the chaos happened. So go to the door you know is there and is unlocked. Okay. The more probative evidence concerns the exit. Yeah, this is kind of what I'm saying. The back door was found open in the early morning hours following the murder. An intruder who had planned and executed a controlled crime would almost certainly have secured his exit point. An open door is the signature of a hasty, unplanned departure. Someone who left under duress, responding to an unexpected development rather than completing a prepared sequence. This is consistent with the interrupted intruder scenario developed below. Just to clarify, guys, I'm not saying that, he's going to have the courtesy to close the door so you don't run up your power bill. What I'm saying is it's instinctive to do that. You don't think about it. Normally, if you were planning this, you would have gone out and you would have very slowly, carefully shut the door. Because you want to leave no trace. Right? It's not that you're trying to do them a favor. You're trying to eliminate any evidence at all. Well, if everything goes sideways, you're not going to care about that anymore. You got to get the hell out of there. Right? The interruption hypothesis. The physical evidence, taken collectively, is most consistent with an intruder whose plan was disrupted. Several elements of the crime scene that have resisted adequate explanation under both the standard intruder theory and family guilt theories resolve cleanly under an interrupted intruder reading. The pineapple assembled on the kitchen table, apparently by a child's effort, given Burke's fingerprints on the spoon and the presence of tea, suggests that Burke and possibly Jonbenet were awake and active in the kitchen late on Christmas night. Okay, the parents may not have known this, but they had definitely gotten up that night. The evidence is just overwhelming. I mean, put it this way: the thing about the Goldilocks narrative is we never claim certainty. We never claim so-and-so did it, right? That's not what we do. What we say is, given the information available to me, and by the application of Occam's razor, this is the most probable narrative, right? Well, most probably, Burke and Jonbenet were up that night. And it fits with Christmas. This is Christmas time. They got toys everywhere. They're going to sneak out and go play with their toys. This isn't surprising. Okay. Neither John nor Patsy reported feeding the children pineapple. Well, that's because Burke served it. This is consistent with the children having gotten up independently after being put to bed. If Burke was in or near the kitchen and the intruder was moving through the home, the probability of an encounter, a noise, a sighting, a moment of mutual awareness was meaningfully elevated. But, let's follow the most likely scenario and positioning of everyone in the house at this critical moment. What I'm saying is most likely is the mother and father were upstairs in bed, probably asleep. Burke was up on the main floor playing with his train, so they'd already eaten. Jonbenet was down in the basement in that little closet. Now, I'm somewhat at a loss to understand why she closed the door, but I think she probably did. She went in there and closed the door. I don't think there were any gifts in there at that point. But, being a kid, she might have gone down there to confirm. So all this had to have happened very quickly. It could be that the perpetrator came out from behind that shelf. There was a hallway leading to that door, and then on the other side of that hallway, there was an opening and a water heater back there. And a window, which is where the scream could have come out and reached to Melody Stanton across the street. But the perpetrator could have been back there. He could have been literally trying to run from her so she wouldn't see him. So he runs back there in that corner. Then she goes in the room, and so he's thinking like most people, well, she goes in the room. If I just come out immediately after she shuts the door, I'm free. Well, she's, 6? She's going to immediately see there's no gifts in there. She's going to turn around and come right back out. I think he was caught on the way out. Right there at that doorway. Okay. An intruder whose primary objective was abduction or assault would not have chosen to leave the body inside the home. Leaving Jonbenet in the basement wine cellar is not a controlled outcome. It is a containment decision made under pressure. The intruder could not remove her once the situation had escalated beyond his control. The body placement is the signature of a plan that went wrong, not one that was executed as designed. The severity and character of the head injury reinforces this reading. An 8.5-inch skull fracture on a 6-year-old child represents extreme disproportionate force. This is not a premeditated, calibrated blow. It is the signature of a panicked, adrenaline-driven, drug-induced strike by someone who needed Jonbenet silent immediately. It didn't quite work because I think she screamed right before he made contact with her. I mean, we're talking split seconds here. The escalation from whatever the intruder's original intent was to a silencing blow of that magnitude is most consistent with a sudden unexpected threat, a noise upstairs, a sibling appearing, and an imminent discovery. And like I said, I think the simplest thing is that she had gone in the room and it just come right back out. And that sort of screwed him up. Because he thought when she went in there, he could sneak out behind her. Because the door was shut. But if all she did was go in there and see there aren't gifts in there, because there weren't, she would have immediately come back out. So, the missing flashlight. One of the most underweighted physical evidence gaps in the case is the absence of a large Maglite-type flashlight from the Ramsey home. Investigators noted evidence consistent with a heavy cylindrical object having caused the skull fracture. A wound profile consistent with a large flashlight. Found on the kitchen counter, was accounted for separately and did not match the wound profile. Think about that, guys. That's not the weapon. An intruder entering an unfamiliar dark home at night would almost certainly carry a flashlight. No such flashlight was recovered from the residence, despite extensive searching. The logical inference is straightforward. The intruder brought a flashlight, used it for navigation, and took it with him when he fled. Its absence from the crime scene is not a neutral data point. It is a missing object signature consistent with the intruder's toolkit. It also, again, shows impulsivity. He wasn't waiting around to drop the flashlight. He was flying out of there. Under the interrogation scenario, the sequence, or interruption scenario, the sequence resolves with high narrative parsimony. The intruder is in the basement with Jonbenet. A noise occurs. Burke in the kitchen. Footsteps upstairs. Jonbenet beginning to scream. The flashlight is in his hands. The fastest available response is a silencing blow. He strikes her with the flashlight until the full force of panic and adrenaline produce the catastrophic fracture. He then uses the garrote, possibly pre-prepared, consistent with his premeditation, to ensure she cannot survive to identify him. He exits through the back door in haste, flashlight still in hand, leaving it open behind him. That's possible, but I think it's more likely that that he just it's not a sign of premeditation as much as it's a sign of panic. He's trying to disturb the evidence, make things look different than they are. The scream. Triggering event for the fatal blow. Neighbor Melody Stanton reported being awakened shortly after midnight by the sound of a child's scream coming from the Ramsey residence. Well, that narrows things down. This is one of the most analytically significant witness reports in the case record, and it has been chronically underweighted in popular analyses. Under the standard intruder theory, the scream is noted and set aside. Under the interrupted intruder thesis, the scream is the linchpin event. The Ramsey home's basement contained a room that family members have described as a dedicated storage area for Christmas gifts and holiday items, effectively a Christmas present room. For a 6-year-old child on Christmas night, still in the excitement of the holiday, the pull of the room would have been powerful and natural. Jonbenet may not have been taken to the basement by the intruder. She may have gone there independently, drawn by the prospect of Christmas presents, and encountered him there. Again, further pointing to something very impulsive. He didn't plan it out and take her across the house and then take her down there. That's unlikely. This reading materially changes the dynamic of the encounter. Rather than a predator who had successfully isolated his victim and was executing a prepared plan, the intruder now finds himself suddenly face to face with a child who was not supposed to be awake, in a room he was occupying in the dark. Or she was. He was occupying the hallway. Jonbenet screams. That scream is what Melody Stanton heard from across the street shortly after midnight, most likely. The intruder's response had to be immediate. He could not allow the scream to continue. It would wake the household within seconds. The flashlight was in his hand. The blow was reflexive. Driven by pure panic, the scream stopped. But the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. An 8.5-inch skull fracture that no amount of subsequent staging could undo. The intruder was now trapped in a situation that had escalated. The intruder was now trapped in a situation that had escalated far beyond anything he had planned. He could not take her. He could not revive her. He finished what the moment had forced him to begin. He used the garrote to ensure she could not survive to identify him. It fled through the back door, leaving it open in his haste. We're also just trying to confuse the crime scene, but who knows? It doesn't really matter. The scream, the Christmas present room, the flashlight, the open back door, and the body left on site. These are not 5 separate anomalies requiring 5 separate explanations. They are a single coherent sequence. The Goldilocks test is passed with full marks. One unbroken causal chain accounts for all of them simultaneously, with no unsupported assumptions required. The Goldilocks narrative assessment is: the interrupted intruder scenario accounts for the body's location, disproportionate force of the head injury, the open back door, and the missing flashlight without introducing a single unsupported assumption. Each element that was previously anomalous under the standard intruder theory becomes explanatorily inert under the interruption reading. This refinement elevates the Goldilocks narrative thesis explanatory power above its already high baseline score. The assault sequence in the improvised garrote. The physical evidence is most consistent with a specific sequence of events that begins with discovery rather than with a planned assault. Jonbenet descended to the basement independently, drawn by the Christmas present room. The intruder was already inside that dark closet, working through the home's storage areas in search of items to steal. When Jonbenet opened the door from the outside, she She did not encounter him in the open basement. She opened the door and found him in the dark. These are two different scenarios I've been kind of going back and forth on. It could have been this way, or he could have been in the closet, or she could have gone into the closet. I'm sort of leaning toward the latter more now, though. Just trying to figure out what would be the simplest explanation. So, yeah, and the scream that Melody Stanton heard from across the street was the immediate reflexive response of a child who came face to face with a stranger in an enclosed space. The intruder's response was equally reflexive. A silencing blow with a flashlight already in his hand, delivered in the doorway at the instant she appeared. Jonbenet fell right there, at the threshold, in the doorway. The void location, where she lost bladder control, at the moment of fatal neurological trauma, confirms this precisely. She died where she fell, at the entrance of that room, and never moved again under her own power. One of the reasons why I'm leaning more towards him being in the room is because the void location was technically outside the door. It was right outside that door. So it would make more sense that he was coming out and she was already outside the room. At this point, the intruder had not yet committed a sexual assault. That came after. The paint tote belonging to Patsy Ramsey was in the basement, essentially at the intruder's feet. He reached into it, took a paintbrush, and snapped it. A single motion taking seconds. He fashioned a crude garrote from the cord. He carried and committed the sexual assault on the already incapacitated or dying child. The sequence matters analytically. The assault was not the purpose of the encounter. It was a secondary act, committed after the situation had already catastrophically escalated beyond any original plan. This reframing has significant implications for the suspect profile. The crime is often categorized as a preferential child predator offense because of the sexual assault component. But if the assault was opportunistic, committed after an unplanned, panicked, silencing blow, the original purpose of the intruder's presence may have been something else entirely. A grievance against John Ramsey, a planned theft, a confrontation that was never supposed to involve Jonbenet at all. The sexual assault, under this reading, is not the motive. It is a terrible act of opportunity by someone already committed to ensuring there was no surviving witness. Okay. All right. The garrote as forensic signature of improvisation. We mentioned this. The garrote's crude, unprofessional construction has been cited by some analysts as evidence pointing toward Burt Ramsey. The argument being that a sophisticated predator would have come prepared with the proper ligature. This argument fails on two grounds. First, given that the DNA establishes an intruder's presence as forensic fact, the garrote's crudeness is no longer an open interpretive question. It is a settled inference. The intruder did not plan to use the garrote because the garrote was not part of his plan. The encounter with Jonbenet was unplanned. The silencing blow was reflexive. The garrote was improvised in seconds from the nearest available material. An unprofessional garrote fashioned from a snapped paintbrush handle is precisely what improvisation under extreme stress produces. Not the signature of a child, but the signature of a person whose plan had just collapsed and who was making decisions in real time. Second, an intruder who planned this crime does not forget to bring a ligature if strangulation was always the intent. The absence of a pre-prepared ligature is itself evidence that the strangulation was not the original plan, consistent with an opportunistic intruder whose encounter with Jonbenet was entirely unplanned. The absence of a pre-prepared ligature is itself evidence that strangulation was not the original plan, consistent with an encounter that escalated suddenly and forced improvisation. The missing bottom third of the paintbrush reinforces this. It was never recovered despite exhaustive searching of the home. The intruder took it with him when he fled, just as he took the flashlight. Two objects, both part of his improvised toolkit, both absent from the crime scene because they left in his hands through the back door he did not stop to close. Their absence is not an evidential gap. It is a coherent forensic signature of a hasty, unplanned exit. The dual trigger. The Goldilocks narrative thesis does not require commitment to a single triggering event, whether Jonbenet's scream upon discovering the intruder was the catalyst, or a noise from Burke in the kitchen above, or both in rapid succession. Any of these produces the same downstream sequence. A theory that holds across multiple plausible trigger scenarios is more parsimonious, not less. The scream in the garrote and the open back door and the missing objects are all consistent with an intruder who was discovered, panicked, improvised, and fled. The ransom note, Patsy authored, intruder crime. The ransom note is the most complex and contested piece of evidence in this case. Under the Goldilocks three-layer thesis, the note is Patsy authored, but written not to cover her own crime and not to cover an intruder's crime, but to cover what she believed in the immediate aftermath was Burke's accidental act, or may have been his accidental act. This framing resolves the note's dual nature. It bears Patsy's linguistic fingerprints because she wrote it, while the crime it ostensibly describes was actually committed by an intruder she did not know had been there. Evidence pointing to Patsy as author. You probably heard this. We're going to go through it real quick. Handwriting. Patsy Ramsey was never eliminated as the author. Multiple handwriting experts found significant similarities between her known exemplars and the note. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation concluded John did not write it. Patsy could not be excluded. The notepad and pen. The note was written on paper from Patsy's personal spiral notebook, using her pen. Both were found in the home. An intruder who brought his own materials would not have used Patsy's. Vocabulary and phrasing. The note's word choices, sentence structures, and emotional register are consistent with the linguistic profile of an educated American woman writing under extreme stress. Wonder who that could be. Forensic linguist James Fitzgerald noted feminine writing traits consistent with Patsy Ramsey's known writing forms. The note reads as an attempt to humanize the situation and protect the family's reputation, not the communication pattern of a criminal extortionist. Let me be real clear about something here. There is software you can run that will tell you whether the author was male or female with something like a 99% accuracy. It's extremely accurate. Okay, so it's not like it's that big of a mystery to figure that out. We know a woman wrote it. The practice note. A partial draft of the ransom note was found in the same notepad. An intruder composing a ransom note would have prepared it in advance or brought it pre-written, not drafted it in the house using the victim's mother's stationery. Forensic linguist James Fitzgerald noted that the printing style showed feminine traits. Like I said, consistent with Patsy Ramsey's known handwriting forms. Length and content. At 2.5 pages, the note is extraordinarily long for a ransom demand. It reads emotionally, not strategically. It attempts to humanize the kidnappers, protect John's business reputation, and make promises about Jonbenet's welfare. These are not the linguistic patterns of a criminal extortionist. They are the patterns of a grieving, panicked mother trying to construct a believable fiction. Why an intruder did not write this note. An intruder would not compose a nearly 3-page note while the family slept upstairs. Unlikely to. An intruder who planned a kidnapping would bring the note pre-written, likely. Using the victim's mother's notepad requires finding it in the dark, in an unfamiliar house, under extreme pressure. An intruder who committed a murder would not leave a ransom note demanding the return of a child already dead in the basement. This creates an immediate investigative focus on the home. The practice draft in the notepad is the most damning detail. The criminal does not practice a ransom note in the victim's own stationery supplies. It's possible, but again, this just blows Occam's razor out of the water. That's just not very likely. When asked on Larry King Live why a kidnapper would write a ransom note for a child already dead, Patsy answered, I think it was, and we already read this, this is a duplication, but she said it was a ruse because she knew it was a ruse. The tragic irony. Patsy wrote the note to protect Burke from suspicion for a crime he did not commit. In doing so, she created the primary instrument that directed suspicion at the entire family for over a decade. Burying the physical and biological evidence of the actual killer under an avalanche of handwriting analysis, linguistic forensics, and media-driven family guilt narrative. The cover-up she constructed to protect her son became the trap that imprisoned her family's reputation. Patsy's psychology, maternal terror, and the notes. To fully understand the Goldilocks 3-layer thesis, it is necessary to inhabit Patsy Ramsey's psychological state in the hours between discovering Jonbenet and calling 911. This is not speculation about guilt. It is an attempt to understand the most human and tragic dimension of this case. What Patsy likely encountered. Patsy discovers Jonbenet dead with blunt force trauma to the skull. In the shock of that moment, no intruder is present. The house is quiet. Her children were home. The head blow, the kind of blow a 9-year-old boy could deliver with a blunt object, becomes the immediate explanatory anchor. Maybe. She does not yet see the garrote, the sexual... I think it's the other way around. I think she does not see the blow to the head, and she sees the garrote. Yeah, that's a typo. It should be the other way around. She does not yet see the garrote, and the garrote is the hint that this was a child, because she wasn't thinking about somebody doing this, hastily. The decision to write the note. Under this interpretation, Patsy makes a decision in those dark hours that it is both comprehensible and catastrophic. She will protect Burke. She writes a ransom note using the materials at hand, her own notepad, her own pen, because she is not a criminal and has no criminal materials. She drafts it once, then writes the full note. She frames it as a kidnapping gone wrong. She sets the demand at $118,000 because that figure, John's Christmas bonus, is a number she knows intimately from their own financial world. And she believes a specific, authentic-seeming figure will lend the note credibility. Okay. Let's see here. I'm going to see what... Make sure we don't have any other... Yeah, I think we're good. All right. Having written the note, Patsy calls 911 and reports the note and the kidnapping. She has now set the stage. She does not know that in the basement, already behind a door she may not have opened fully, or in a room she did not fully examine in her shock, Jonbenet's body lies with a garrote. Possibly. With DNA from an unknown male under her fingernails, with evidence of sexual assault. She may not have known the full scope of what the intruder did. She knew her daughter was dead. She thought she knew why. This interpretation does not exonerate Patsy of moral culpability in what followed. She obstructed the investigation. She misdirected law enforcement. She helped bury the evidence trail of the actual killer. But she did not murder Jonbenet, and she did not intend to protect a murderer. She intended to protect a child she believed had caused a terrible accident. Okay. The silence trap. Why Patsy could never confess. Now here's where it gets interesting. You're like, why don't you just come clean? Well, you can't. One of the most persistent questions raised against the Goldilocks narrative three-layer thesis is deceptively simple. If Patsy Ramsey was innocent of the murder, why did she never come forward to explain what she had done and why? The answer lies in the structure of American criminal jurisprudence. And it is one of the most tragically ironic dimensions of this case. The moment Patsy admitted to writing the ransom note, she was not confessing to maternal panic. She was confessing to felony obstruction of a homicide investigation, a serious charge that, attached to a child murder case, would have been prosecuted with maximum aggression. Obstruction of justice in connection with a murder carries severe sentencing exposure. But the legal jeopardy was only part of the trap. The deeper problem was that no jury, no prosecutor, and no member of the public would cleanly separate "I wrote the note to protect my son because I thought he had hurt her" from "I wrote the note to protect myself because I killed her." The admission of note authorship was functionally indistinguishable from a murder confession in any realistic prosecutorial or public context. The obstruction charge and the murder charge would have been tied together, and the jury would have drawn the obvious inference. A mother who committed felony obstruction of a murder investigation did so because she was guilty of the murder. It's a trap. Patsy was therefore trapped by her own cover-up in a way that made honesty carry nearly identical consequences to guilt. Every lawyer she consulted, and she consulted some of the best criminal defense attorneys in the country, would have told her the same thing. Do not admit to writing that under any circumstances. The silence that investigators in the public read as consciousness of guilt was in fact the rational, legally advised response of a woman who had committed a serious felony in a moment of grief and could not uncommit it without destroying herself. This is the final and most human layer of the GN thesis. Patsy Ramsey spent the last decade of her life under a cloud of public suspicion for a murder she did not commit, unable to offer the one explanation that would have reframed everything, because the explanation would have confirmed the felony and invited the inference of the greater crime. She died in 2006 without clearing her name. The silence trap closed around her the moment she put pen to paper on that morning of December 26, 1996. It never opened again. The silence trap is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of a woman caught between a felony she committed in grief and a murder she did not commit, unable to confess the one without being convicted of the other. Under American jurisprudence, her silence was not just understandable, it was the only rational option available to her. The red dress fibers, apparent incrimination, actual exoneration. Red fibers consistent with the dress Patsy Ramsey was wearing that night were tentatively matched to fibers found in Jonbenet's body. This evidence has been cited by family guilt theorists as placing Patsy in physical contact with her daughter at or near the time of death. Under the Goldilocks narrative thesis, this evidence resolves cleanly and carries no incriminating weight whatsoever. Patsy discovered her daughter's body. Whatever her state of shock and grief, her first instinct, the instinct of any mother, would have been to go to her child, to touch her, to check whether she was still alive. Kneeling over Jonbenet in the dress she had been wearing all evening would have transferred fibers directly and inevitably The red dress fibers are not evidence of commission. They are evidence of a mother doing exactly what any mother would do upon finding her child. The fiber transfer is the forensic signature of grief, not guilt. Under the Goldilocks narrative thesis, this evidence thread does not require explanation. It requires only recognition. A grieving mother who has just discovered her daughter's body and who has not yet processed the full picture of what happened would have approached and touched the child. That contact is the entire explanation. The red dress fibers belong in the same analytical category as Patsy's fingerprints on the notepad. Present because she was there, not because she killed. Okay, now we're going to go through the matrix, the scoring, and yeah, it just shows you how we scored all this. And the Goldilocks narrative scores are here. Oh gosh, hold on. Get this back up here. Oh, gotta find it now. We went flying all over the place. Hang on. Hold on. That's not it. Okay. There. They're scored from 0 to 1. 1 is absolute certainty, which will never happen. 0 is absolutely falsified, which will also never happen. It has to be something between 0 and 1. 093 is the score we give for the hypothesis here advanced. Yep. Okay. Alrighty. Investigative failures and their analytical weight. In the Goldilocks framework, documented investigative failures are not bureaucratic footnotes. They are data. The question is always, who benefited from each failure? And does the pattern of failures point consistently in one direction? The Boulder Police Department's critical failures. Scene contamination, day 1. Boulder police allowed friends and family into the home after Jonbenet was reported missing, but before a thorough search. This contaminated trace evidence and muddied chain of custody questions. The basement search order. Police asked John Ramsey to search the house himself, leading to him finding and moving the body, removing duct tape from her mouth and carrying her upstairs. This is a fundamental investigative failure that compromised the crime scene irrevocably. DNA suppression. The January 1997 DNA analysis confirming the unknown male profile did not match any family member, was reportedly not shared with the DA's office for months. Bad. The family remained under umbrella of suspicion for over a decade, despite this exculpatory evidence existing in the Boulder Police Department's possession. Tunnel vision. BPD's near-exclusive focus on the Ramsey family from day 1 meant that 95% of the more than 3,000 tips received in the immediate aftermath were not followed up on, according to multiple investigative accounts. This is a classic example of how, law enforcement is trained to investigate things in a certain way based on statistics and everything. And usually, stuff like this, it is a crime committed by someone in the home. But that's a broad national statistic. When you start controlling for things like income, education, so on and so forth, the probability of an in-home homicide drops precipitously. So when you're trying to play around with probabilities, you really need to understand what you're doing, because it can be very misleading, right? For the general population, yes, it's usually going to be someone in the home. People like this, not so much. Okay. Now, you can argue over the reasons for that, but that's just the way the statistics are. Okay. Evidence not submitted for testing. John Ramsey has stated that 6 to 7 items sent to labs early in the investigation were returned untested. The garage itself was reportedly among them. Wow. Media leaks. Boulder Police Department reportedly leaked investigative information to the press, sometimes fabricated, to increase pressure on the Ramseys. This poisoned the investigative environment and made impartial forensic work functionally impossible. I agree. Lou Smith's dissent. Retired detective Lou Smith, brought in by the DA's office specifically because of his reputation for rigor, concluded by 1998 that the evidence pointed directly to an intruder. His resignation letter is one of the most analytically significant documents in the case record. For the past quarter century, the Boulder police have ignored the DNA evidence that exonerated the Ramseys and could be used to identify her killer. He spent years after his resignation investigating the case independently, at his own expense, before his death in 2010. I think he really believed in his narrative. Now, I think that's all authentic, but you know what we have to say about belief, right? He was going in the right direction, sure, but then again, so were some of the others. It's just nobody could kind of get it all together. His files, which include the unredacted January 1997 DNA report, were shared with investigators after his death and form part of the evidentiary basis for the 25-26 forensic reexamination. And here we are with the reexamination. As of December 2025, the Boulder Police Department confirmed that newly submitted physical evidence, including portions of the garrote cord, a second section of the paintbrush handle, and previously untested clothing swabs, is being analyzed at an advanced forensic library. Sources familiar with the investigation report that partial genetic profiles have already been isolated from two separate items. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, is standing by. Colorado's database now contains over 250,000 convicted offender profiles, improving the probability of a familial match to the unknown male DNA donor. City officials have quietly begun preparing for the possibility of an arrest. So, the Goldilocks narrative is here. And we're going to just walk through it real quick. An unknown male, most likely a drug-addicted, opportunistic thief, entered the Ramsey residence on Christmas night 1996 through the unlocked back door. He was working through the basement in the dark, searching for presents and valuables to steal and fence, when Jonbenet came downstairs, drawn by the Christmas present room. She opened the door to the storage closet where she was concealed. He was inside that dark space when she found him. One of the two. Either she went in there and was alone and she came out and bumped into him, or this. I really am beginning to lean, though, more toward, I think it's more likely that it's going to be her coming out of that room and bumping into him, which is really screwy. She screamed. He struck her with a flashlight in his hand, a single panic blow in the doorway, and she fell where she stood at the threshold of that room. The void location confirms she died there, at the entrance to the Christmas closet, and never moved again under her own power. So really kind of just outside that threshold. And that's why I'm rethinking this. Like, this may be her coming out of the room. He then grabbed Patsy's paintbrush from the paint toad at his feet, snapped it, fashioned a crude garrote, and committed a sexual act on the dying child. He fled through the back door in a blind panic, taking the flashlight and the paintbrush handle with him, leaving the door open behind him. He left behind his DNA under the fingernails of both her hands, the biological signature of her last moments of consciousness, and in her underwear, and an unidentified boot print in the wine cellar. The theft he came to commit was never executed. He left with nothing but the evidence of what he had done. Patsy Ramsey, discovering her daughter's body in the early morning hours, processed the head trauma through the lens of maternal panic and concluded Burke was responsible. Actually, the garrote she was processing. Knowing Jonbenet was dead, she wrote a ransom note using her own notepad and pen to deflect investigators from her son. She called 911 and reported a kidnapping. The note she wrote bore her own linguistic fingerprints, her own vocabulary, her own knowledge of John's bonus. Yeah, her own grammatical errors, too. She had unique grammatical errors, like and hence, which the correct way to say that is hence. You don't put an and on it. She put and hence. It was a mother's last desperate act constructed to protect a child she believed had caused her sister's death. What Patsy did not know, could not have known in those dark hours of shock and grief, was that she was covering for an intruder who had already left. The garrote, the sexual assault, the unknown DNA, these were the intruder's work, not Burke's. The note she wrote to protect her son from suspicion became, instead, the instrument that buried the intruder's trail for nearly 3 decades. Why the Goldilocks narrative has superior explanatory power. Every competing theory requires the analyst to explain away significant evidence. The Goldilocks narrative requires the analyst to explain away nothing. It's an important point. Every competing theory requires the analyst to explain away significant evidence. The Goldilocks narrative requires the analyst to explain away nothing. Consider the unknown male DNA under both fingernails, accounted for. The intruder's DNA deposited during Jonbenet's defensive struggle. The unknown male DNA in underwear and long johns, accounted for. The same intruder, consistent profile across intimate contact points. The boot print in the wine cellar, accounted for. The intruder's footwear. The unlocked back door entry-exit point, accounted for. The intruder's access and hasty departure. The open back door found in the early morning hours is the exit signature of an interrupted, panicked intruder. Let me go back to that footwear real quick. We know that there was footwear that had to be accounted for because the footwear was really, it was too big for Burke or Jonbenet. It was more like an adult size. So that had to be accounted for somehow. The ransom note's family language fingerprints, accounted for. Patsy wrote it. The practice draft in Patsy's notepad, accounted for. Patsy drafted it using her own materials. The ransom note's emotional, non-criminal tone, accounted for. A grieving mother wrote it, not a criminal extortionist. The $118,000 demand matching John's bonus, accounted for. Patsy knew the figure and used it to lend her fabricated note credibility. This detail points to Patsy as author, not an intruder with financial insider knowledge. On this point, and again, here we go again with this. On this point, the fewest number of assumptions with the same explanatory power is that the $118,000 figure came from Patsy, not from a financial insider or an intruder with financial insider knowledge. That's a bigger assumption. Like we know Patsy knew. It's not even an assumption. She knew. So we have to assume this. We have to add this to the narrative. Let's get rid of that. The Ramseys' reluctance to cooperate with BPD accounted for. Patsy knew the note was hers. Cooperation risked exposure of the cover-up, regardless of the underlying truth. The family's formal exoneration by DNA accounted for. The DNA was always an intruder's. The exoneration was scientifically appropriate and long overdue. Outstanding questions. Who was the intruder? The Goldilocks narrative identifies the intruder as an unknown male with prior knowledge of the family, their home, their schedule, and John Ramsey's financial details. No. Had to know they were probably wealthy, but that would have been obvious, because of the neighborhood he was in, pretty much. This knowledge profile suggests one of several suspect categories: a current or former employee of Access Graphics or a Ramsey business contact, a contractor or service worker with prior access to the home, someone connected to the child beauty pageant circuit with an obsession focused on Jonbenet. Gary Oliva, a convicted pedophile who attended the same school as a Ramsey family connection, has repeatedly confessed to the murder. 2 handwriting experts in 23 concluded his writing is very likely consistent with the ransom note. Though this is contested, I would say this is less than likely. Just from the Goldilocks narrative we just put together, this is going to require a lot more assumptions and a lot more. It's not going to be nearly as straightforward. Okay, forensic questions. Genetic genealogy. What's going to happen there? Advanced DNA testing on the garrote and paintbrush. Another genetic genealogy opportunity. Do those items not test still exist? Can they be tested? I'm not sure you could use touch DNA analysis on the note now. It's probably contaminated, but that's an interesting, possibility. Could be checked. The Jonbenet Ramsey case is not, in the Goldilocks sense, an unsolvable mystery. It is a case whose solution has been present in the evidence from the beginning. Submerged under 3 decades of investigative tunnel vision, media spectacle, and the extraordinary irony of a mother's cover-up obscuring the crime of an actual killer. The Goldilocks narrative 3-layer thesis. Intruder murder. Patsy's acute suspicion of Burke. Patsy's note writing to cover him is the only analytical framework that accounts for all material evidence simultaneously. It explains the DNA without dismissing the note. It explains the note without dismissing the DNA. It resolves the apparent contradiction at the heart of the case. How can a crime scene contain both unmistakable physical evidence of an intruder and a ransom note bearing a dead woman's linguistic fingerprints? The answer is that both things can be true. And under the Goldilocks narrative, both things are true. The intruder was there. Patsy wrote the note. These two facts are not contradictory. They are complementary layers of a single tragic night. Jonbenet Ramsey was 6 years old. She fought her killer. Her DNA under her fingernails tells us that. Modern forensic science now has the tools to identify the man whose skin cells she clawed from his body in her last moments.
The 2025-26 re-examination is the most important investigative development in the case's history. Alrighty. The Demon with 1,000 Faces, Belief, Feral Cognition, and the Jonbenet Ramsey case. A little interesting epilogue here. This one was particularly interesting when it comes to, the nature of belief and how this works. I think it's a very good case study in it. It really shows you, how you can be misled with that. The Jonbenet Ramsey case is not only a study in investigative failure. It is a near-perfect demonstration of a deeper phenomenon, the way in which human belief formation, when driven by feral emotional triggers rather than rational evidential analysis, produces conclusions that are immune to falsification, and that persist in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. The Demon with 1,000 Faces is an analytical framework for understanding this phenomenon. Its central argument is that belief co-evolved with intelligence as an adaptive mechanism, a cognitive shortcut that allowed early humans to act quickly on pattern recognition rather than exhaustive deliberation. Belief was useful in a low-technology environment with limited information. It was often survival critical. But belief becomes pathological when it is formed on feral emotional triggers rather than evidence, and when the social and technological environment amplifies those triggers to a mass scale. Feral belief formation in the Jonbenet Ramsey case. The Jonbenet Ramsey case activated feral belief formation through a convergence of emotionally supercharged triggers that were impossible for the general public and much of the investigative community to process rationally. A 6-year-old girl, a beauty pageant, photographs of a child in adult makeup and costumes, wealthy parents, a lavish home, a Christmas murder. These elements do not invite deliberate analysis. They detonated in the public consciousness and produced immediate visceral belief. The parents did it. The salacious nature of the imagery, the beauty pageant footage, the sexualized framing of a child that the media both criticized and relentlessly broadcast, fomented a specific emotional response that made rational evidential evaluation nearly impossible for most observers. The public's theory was not derived from evidence. It was derived from disgust, suspicion of wealth, outrage at the pageant world, and the statistical heuristic that family members kill children. These are feral inputs. They produce feral conclusions. Falsification without correction. What makes the Jonbenet case the most powerful demonstration of feral belief formation in modern true crime history is not that people formed the wrong beliefs. It is that the evidence to falsify those beliefs was available from January 1997, within weeks of the murder, and was systematically ignored for over a decade. The unknown male DNA profile was recovered during the autopsy. It did not match any family member. It was present under the fingernails of both hands and in the underwear, the most intimate evidentiary contact points on the victim's body. Under any rational evidential framework, this data point alone should have redirected the investigation outward within weeks. Instead, the Boulder Police Department suppressed it. The media ignored it. And the public's feral belief in family guilt continued unchallenged for 11 years until the 2008 DNA-based exoneration. This is feral technological agency in practice. A belief system, the family did it, that was formed on emotional triggers, amplified by mass media technology, institutionalized by an investigative apparatus that had already committed to its conclusion, and rendered immune to falsification by the very strength of the emotional investment in it. The evidence did not change the belief. The belief filtered the evidence. Rational technological agency and the Goldilocks narrative. The Goldilocks narrative is, in the language of the Demon with 1,000 Faces, an exercise in rational technological agency. The deliberate application of evidence economy principles to override the feral cognitive patterns that dominate popular true crime discourse. Its Occam's razor foundation is specifically designed to resist the narrative pull of emotionally satisfying theories in favor of the theory with the highest explanatory power per unit of evidential assumption. Applied to the Jonbenet case, the Goldilocks narrative produces a result that most feral belief observers find counterintuitive. And this is where we're talking about examine the hypothesis or narrative that is the least desirable. Start there. That's what we did here. We just started with the least desirable conclusion. or, presumptive conclusion. And it's that the family is largely exonerated, but not entirely innocent. Patsy committed a serious felony out of maternal grief. The actual killer was probably an unknown opportunistic intruder whose DNA has been in the evidence records since December 1996. The case is not a mystery of missing evidence. It is a case whose solution has been available for nearly 3 decades. Buried under the accumulated weight of feral belief formation that infected the investigation from its first hours and never fully released its grip. The Jonbenet Ramsey case is what happens when a society processes a tragedy through feral emotional triggers rather than evidential analysis. The beauty pageant images, the wealth, the Christmas setting, the dead child, these activated belief, not reason. The DNA was always there. The rational framework was always available. The demon with 1,000 faces ensures that neither is sufficient on its own to displace the belief formed in fire. And you just got references there if you want to freeze notes. All right.